Hello, my name is Brian Betancourt. I'm assistant professor and Spanish language coordinator at Bronx Community College of the City University of New York. And before I begin, I'd just like to thank the organizers of this event for centering the important topic of gender inclusivity in language and for giving me this opportunity to discuss inclusive language in the context of ethnic identity. And my presentation will focus primarily on two ethnic identifiers, Latinx and Latina. And discussing these terms, I think, allows us to reflect on two overlapping, overarching, and complex questions. Right? First, how can we or how should we identify persons of Latin American descent? And second, what do we communicate when we claim to use inclusive language? And more important, how can we ensure that language is genuinely inclusive? So I'll begin with Latinx, an identifier that has gained increased visibility over the past decade, both in and out of academia, right? So we find the term on social media, right? Here are just a couple of tweets, right, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Julian Castro. We find the term in marketing materials. Here's a photo I took outside of a Macy's, an ad from Peloton. Also programs of study. This is from my own campus, a flyer for the Black and Latinx Studies program. And in academic job ads, right? Here's a part of a job ad for a lecturer in Latinx literature and cultures. And this is just, of course, a very small sampling of what we can find out there. And like many people, I first became aware of Latinx's growing presence, right, following the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. And you'll recall that most victims of this mass shooting were LGBTQ persons of Latin American descent. And you can see just a few headlines here. However, the term Latinx first appears in Google Trends around 2004 and in academic and activist outlets around 2015. And as most of you, I'm sure, know, the term Latinx is an alternative to the gendered Latino, Latina. And of course, Latino and Latina is itself a response and sort of a rejection to Hispanic, part of this sort of genealogy of ethnic identifiers that has evolved in this country, right? So this non-gendered or this gender-neutral Latinx was meant to be inclusive of non-binary persons. And in the aftermath of the Pulse nightclub shooting, the increased presence of Latinx in news and academic discourse, et cetera, represented an act of solidarity with the LGBTQ community. But of course, the effort to neutralize grammatical gender hasn't been limited to Latinx, right? The letter X is also increasingly used, right, to replace O and A endings in other gendered nouns and adjectives in Spanish. I'll just give you 3 examples here. And also, to be clear, this is not just to be inclusive of non-binary persons. It's also meant to avoid using masculine plural forms to identify groups that include women, right? So to avoid using, for example, todos to describe or to identify a group made up of more women than men, which is seen as invisibilizing women, right? So this trend, though laudable in its goal to generate more inclusive language, is, I think, necessarily limited to writing, right? As the terminology created with the X ending can be nonsensical in spoken Spanish unless these words are pronounced following existing conventions of the language. And that's something that I will address later in this presentation. Mexican linguist Concepcion Compani and others have affirmed that using language in this way privileges writing over orality and excludes groups that lack formal writing systems. These populations, which include some of Latin America's indigenous communities, are thus denied equal opportunity to use language to foment social activism. And even among indigenous communities with writing systems, several, such as the Quechua and Magarifuna, don't have an X in their alphabets, right? Further complicating the use of terms such as Latinx. And linguistic trends kind of restricted to writing also exclude persons with limited schooling and low literacy skills, right? So This is particularly true in Latin America, right? A region with one of the worst rates of socioeconomic disparity in the world. And this according to a 2020 UNESCO report. And you can see in this graphic, right, the darker blue is an indication of worse wealth inequality, right? And in Latin America, education and literacy gaps are most prominent in indigenous and Afro-descended communities. You can see this graph from a 2018 World Bank report in which educational attainment, right, in the Afro-descendant population is lower in primary and secondary school across rural and urban areas, right, across Latin America. So in restricting the access that these groups have to a linguistic practice that's used primarily by US college students and by academics, Latinx and the related use of X in writing has the potential to further marginalize underrepresented populations. And I'd add that even literate persons who don't spend significant time engaged with writing, journals, books, social media, et cetera, are potentially kept out of the conversation regarding Latinx and inclusive language. But I think we can avoid what has been identified, right, as the elitist undercurrents associated with Latinx if we use Latine, an ethnic identifier that employs the letter E to neutralize the gender binary in Latino and Latina. Spanish already contains gender-neutral words that end in E, estudiante, inteligente, interesante, etc., making Latine and the use of the letter E to replace O and A endings a logical extension of what already exists in the language. Now, proponents of Latinx at times, to me, downplay the issues inherent in neutralizing gender with a letter X by noting that individuals who identify as Latinx are mostly US born and English speaking, and that Spanish is a colonial language, right, that marginalized indigenous and African tongues. So the argument here is that adhering to conventions of the Spanish language ostensibly propagates the legacy of colonialism, a legacy that terms such as Latinx work to dismantle. So in addition to a project of creating greater linguistic visibility for women and non-binary persons, there's also a project here of decolonizing the language. So first, I think it's worth noting that when these and similar terms are used in speech, the X is almost always pronounced as an E. This would be amigue, queride, todes, right, etc. So if the letter X is an attempt to decolonize language, this attempt is limited really to writing, because in spoken Spanish, consonant clusters like GX, DX, etc., are unintelligible unless the speaker defaults to an existing convention of the language. And this disjunction between linguistic modes can be avoided, and I think should be avoided given what I've just talked about regarding elitist use of language, the exclusion of groups with limited schooling, literacy, and Spanish fluency, right? And this disjunction, of course, doesn't exist when the letter E is used to neutralize grammatical gender. There might be some spelling changes, but these words are easy enough to read, right? Amigue, queride, todas, right? But I think perhaps more important, I would also argue that the use of any identifier rooted in the prefix Latin, right, regardless of whether it's Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine, can be thought to propagate the legacy of colonialism. And that's because the term Latin America, though not coined in France, was popularized by the French government in the late 19th century to highlight the common linguistic and cultural roots of Spanish, French, and Portuguese-speaking countries, thereby, supposedly, right, justifying Napoleon III's imperialist pretensions in Mexico and the Caribbean. So truly rejecting this imperialist past would require new ethnic identifiers that move beyond the Latin prefix. In the meantime, Latinx and the concurrent use of the letter X exclude a significant portion of the more than 460 million native Spanish speakers in the world, for whom the language is not some abstract remnant of colonialism, but a lived, vital means of communication. To me, this seems at times like a case of academia or the ivory tower, focusing on theory and ideology to the detriment of the reality of the greater community. And as to the argument that individuals who identify as Latinx are mostly US born and English speaking, it's true that fluency in Spanish doesn't make one a more authentic, right, quote unquote authentic, member of the linguistically diverse communities of the Americas. But supporting a practice because it's intelligible in English, I think, implicitly separates persons of Latin American descent into two groups: monolingual Spanish speakers, or even bilingual persons who prefer to communicate in Spanish, and those who were born in the US and primarily speak English. And this sort of de facto division runs counter to assertions that Latinx denotes inclusivity. Many descendants of Latin American immigrants might not feel a strong attachment to Spanish, but that doesn't mean the language in its spoken form should be dismissed. Expecting a multinational ethnic group to tolerate language simply because it is acceptable to English speakers in the US is, I think, in and of itself, an instance of linguistic imperialism. And I think part of the reason we continue to see Latinx instead of Latine, both in and out of academia in this country, is that Latine and the related use of the letter E to render more inclusive language has roots in Latin America and Spain, while in the US, academics, politicians, the media, et cetera, primarily value and legitimize intellectual currents that circulate in this country. And I'll give you a few examples of what I mean. Politicians such as Argentine President Alberto Fernandez, Colombian Vice President Francia Marquez, have used words such as todes, amigues, personas in their speeches, evidence that these terms are accessible to Spanish speakers regardless of schooling or literacy. In a similar vein, Taiwanese Spanish musician and activist Chenza Tsai-Tseng uses terms such as nosotres and compañeres in their 2019 memoir, Arroz Tres Delicias, while passages in Argentine writer Ana Ojeda's 2019 novel, Vikinga Bonsai, include phrases such as les chiques, right, instead of los chicos. As these and other examples make clear, inclusive language rendered with the letter E can exist with equal ease and strive for the same social impact in both speaking and writing. Meanwhile, US politicians, primarily Democrats, as you can see in this graphic from a recent Pew Research report, have increasingly used Latinx in social media posts since 2015, despite growing evidence that only 3% of US Hispanic adults refer to themselves as Latinx, right? This is language directly from another Pew Research report from 2019. With as many as 4 in 10 members of this heterogeneous population finding the term irksome or offensive, right? This from a 2021 Bendixson and Amandi International poll. So this notion that Latinx could be considered offensive, I think is interesting and merits further discussion, because this idea has come to a head, at least in political circles, in 2 recent legislative attempts to ban the term Latinx from official government use, right? So in January, Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders issued an executive order, quote, to respect the Latino community by eliminating culturally insensitive words, and she really means Latinx here, from official use in government. And that's the actual title of the executive order. Several weeks later, Democratic State Representative Geraldo Reyes of Connecticut and 4 co-sponsors, all of whom are of Latin American descent, proposed a bill that would similarly ban the word Latinx from state documents. Now, to be clear, the question of using Latinx in political spheres is not new, right? In 2021, for example, Democratic Representative Ruben Gallego of Arizona prohibited his staff from using Latinx in official communications, claiming the term was used by, quote, Latino politicos, largely to appease white, rich progressives who think that this is the term we, meaning Latinos, use, right? So there's a lot to be said about this tweet here, right, with regard to this idea of elitist use of language and the connection to race, class, political views, et cetera. But I'm particularly interested in the two recent stories involving Sanders and Reyes, because despite being on opposing sides of the political spectrum, the two politicians have given similar reasons for their respective legislation. So you can see on the screen here, this also, again, comes from Sarah Sanders' executive order. Quote, the Real Academia Española has officially rejected the use of X as an alternative to O and A in Spanish, and one can no more easily remove gender from Spanish and other Romance languages than one can remove vowels and verbs from English. And then this from an interview reported by Connecticut Public Radio, Reyes says, quote, Spanish has been around for over 500 years. It's always been inclusive. It's a part of the Romance languages. It has used the O and the A for gender specifics and neutrality. So both politicians argue that even though Spanish and other Romance languages have grammatical gender, inclusiveness and neutrality are built into these languages, making new terms, such as Latinx, unnecessary and potentially offensive. Now, I mentioned these two stories because ultimately I reject both Sanders and Reyes' fundamental argument. Reyes does not make specific mention of the Real Academia like Sanders does, but his stance that existing Spanish pronouns can encompass both masculine and feminine echoes the Real Academia's reasons for rejecting the use of X and E to render more inclusive language. Now, I don't want to suggest an ethical equivalence between Sanders and Reyes, but I do think we have to ask ourselves, if Latinx is offensive, as Sanders, Reyes, Gallego, and others affirm, to whom is it offensive and why? If it's offensive to straight cisgender persons because language is some kind of stagnant relic that cannot or ought not be changed, then one has to wonder if what is actually being defended here is not so much language as misogynistic and or transphobic ideas. And I've made critical remarks about Latinx in this presentation, but not because I oppose gender neutral language. If I reject anything, it's traditionalist, inflexible beliefs regarding the evolution of language and appealing to bodies like the Real Academia as ultimate authorities in matters that have as much to do with social activism as with language usage. That kind of top-down approach is precisely what I am arguing against. Language does not reside in an elite few, but in every speaker. And appealing to every speaker implies acknowledging and respecting a wide range of literacy skills, educational level, and Spanish fluency. And it's from that kind of bottom-up perspective that we should address these questions of language and ethnic identity. So of course, the question of how to identify the over 700 million people of Latin American ancestry is a thorny one, and it has been for a long time. Some people believe we should use ethnic identifiers derived from indigenous languages. But that, of course, is complicated because which one would we choose and how do we make that decision, right? And still others reject outright the existence of a single transnational term, such as Hispanic or Latino or Latinx, given the tendency of Latinas to self-identify using national adjectives, right? Mexican, Cuban, Colombian American, Dominican American, et cetera. And I don't have time, right, to address those arguments here, but I mention them as a reminder that the conversation regarding ethnic identifiers is far from over. And as the discussion continues to unfold, it's important that we think critically and not just about Latinx, but about what we communicate when we claim to use inclusive language. So I'll end it there, and I thank you very much for your time and for your attention. And I look forward to continuing this conversation at next week's live event. Well, thank you very much.